storeroom in the back. You should keep your mouth closed back there. I have a little space. I'd like to welcome all of you to Fort Nisqually. My name is Melissa McGinnis, and I'm the site manager here. I am overjoyed and in awe of the response that we've had to our lecture series this winter. When we started this project about 4 or 5 years ago, we almost had to pay people driving by to come in and fill up some space here in the trade store. Even though our topics were just as great, the word hadn't got out. And this year we've really been just really grateful for the additional publicity, thanks to the News Tribune, the great article yesterday, and lots of other press and other local newspapers and so forth. And today's speaker, I won't bore you too much because today's speaker is just wonderful. I know some of you have been sitting here for a while. You listened to that notice of get here early and get a seat because this is about it for the building today. So anybody who's later than you is not going to be able to make it in today, I'm afraid. But today's speaker is very well known to those people who've been around Fort Nisqually for a while, and she's standing over in the corner. We're not even going to let her come up front. This is Fort Nisqually's curator, Doreen Beard-Simpkins. Doreen has been working here at Fort Nisqually since 1983 and has had lots of different job hats she's worn over time, but now we try to let her focus on being the curator, the person responsible for the artifacts and researching the different items associated with the fort. And everyone who volunteers out here dresses in period clothing counts on her to answer all our questions at all times and know everything. So I think you're in for a real treat with your talk today. Doreen does have a degree in history from, say the wrong one, Colorado State.
Colorado State.
Colorado State. Okay, I had to make sure I don't use the wrong Colorado school.
You need to read one.
She's getting taped by everybody today. And she also did her graduate work with the University of California. And she has...
I'm trying to just turn the tape. But you have to
Flip the
eject
tape.
it first. Yeah. Do that. The eject is not working. You can't.
There we go. We'll let her fix her tape recorder. We'll get things going. Because at this point, what I'd like to do is just, again, thank you. And by the way, when you get through, for all your patients who are sitting so closely packed together, we will have some lemonade and cookies out front if you want to chat with Doreen and ask some more questions later on. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Doreen Simpkins.
Okay. Thank you. The peanut gallery and back, I can tell already. Like Melissa, I'd like to just thank all of you for coming out here today. It's wonderful, a thrill for us to know that there's this many people interested in this topic. I do have a bit of a confession to make. The newspapers picked up on us, I think, because this is National Women's History Month. And when Melissa and I were planning this talk back in the fall, we had no clue about that. We just think it's interesting year-round. So it's just a little bit of luck, I guess, that it fell in this month. Hopefully that's not a comment on us as historians that we didn't know that this was National Women's History Month. What I'd like to do today is to show a lot of slides. I've got a fair amount to go through simply because it really does take you out of the setting in Tacoma, even the setting of Fort Nisqually up in Point Defiance Park. There are marvelous historical images, as well as you'll probably see some familiar faces up here too, because there aren't that many pictures or images of women, so I sort of have to fill in from some of the people that you see in period clothing around here. But I'm going to be showing you a lot of images that show you why they are dressed that way or why they are doing what they're doing in some of those views. So I'd like to take the bulk of the time to do that, talk about the fort, to give you a little bit of background on that, because you really can't understand the position of women and families at Hudson's Bay Company forts without understanding some of this background. And then when we get through that, I'd like to just sort of highlight some of the individuals that were here at Fort Nisqually. Towards the end of the slideshow is when their pictures come up, their photographs if we have them. And then at the very end, I'd like to just point out some of the sources, what we call primary sources, that are the actual records that have come down to us from these people, whether it's a document like an engraving or an actual diary, that sort of thing. And then the secondary sources, which are books that have been written using these sources. The books that we end up using most of the time, if you're going into a bookstore, you go in and get a secondary source on the primary one. And then at the conclusion of that, I'd be glad to try and answer any questions. I think what you find out as a historian is that as you get older, probably too, that's part of it, but it's a very humbling experience because the more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn, and you're just never going to know it all. So hopefully if you have questions, I can answer them, but I fully expect to say, I don't know, I wish I did. So please, if you have questions, ask me at the end. So let's go ahead and get started with some of the slides. And I always like to start out with this one. It's a habit I picked up from a certain individual in this room who I believe took the photograph. The history of Fort Nisqually we find fascinating. It's one of those unique periods of history. Didn't last all that long in terms of the history of Washington State, if you look at it from eons ago up until the present. But I like to start out with this one just as a symbol of unlocking some of the things we'd like to know. And then go into this slide, simply because with Fort Nisqually you can't just talk about this one unique place that maybe just beamed down here, or like Brigadoon, we call this our Brigadoon slide, just sort of emerged out of the mist. Fort Nisqually was part of a large operation that was started a long time ago, in 1670 as a matter of fact, by essentially the English. They were given a royal charter, a couple of Frenchmen I should say were given a royal charter by Charles II of England to essentially come over to what's now North America and begin trapping and profiting from the fur trade. This was the Hudson's Bay Company that started out in 1670. You can see it does go back quite a ways with the clothing that they're wearing. And again, you have to forget about modern political divisions, what we're used to looking at when we look at a map of the 50 states or the provinces of Canada, and go back even a little bit further. This is showing you essentially, obviously, northern North America. You can see down in our area down there where it says Columbia District in modern Washington and Oregon. The 49th parallel does not go all the way across. It didn't back then. That's something that happened during the period that Fort Nisqually was here. But the Hudson's Bay Company started out as obviously in that area, Hudson Bay, over 2.5 centuries absorbed all their other fur trade rivals and were spreading west. So when you talk about Fort Nisqually, you're really talking about the history, one small part of the history of an organization that had been up and going for well over 150 years by the time they established Fort Nisqually in the 1830s. So it wasn't just something that just sort of appeared here. Again, focusing in a little bit more closely on our region. This is a little bit earlier because it's showing you actually before the Hudson's Bay Company was really established here. These are mostly some American fur trade forts and Northwest Company forts. And again, getting even a little bit more focused in on our region here with Fort Vancouver, which is way down at the bottom underneath that trap there. And then Fort Nisqually, obviously, there on Puget Sound. Fort Vancouver was the capital fort, essentially, of the Hudson's Bay Company in this area. This is actually Astoria, which predated Vancouver by a little bit. The British ended up taking over Fort Astoria, which, as the name indicates, was on the site of what's now Astoria, Oregon. After the War of 1812, the British took it over. And if you look at it, if you think of Astoria, where Astoria is now, it's on the southern bank of the Columbia. Okay, the reason that a few years later they established Fort Vancouver as their main depot, after spreading across the continent, was because if you stop and think about it, that Columbia River is the natural geographical boundary between what the British hoped would eventually be American and the properties that they would get to keep. The British were betting that and hoping that they would get to keep north of the Columbia River. Didn't happen that way, but that's why if you're driving down to Portland today and you're kind of wondering, if you stop and wonder about those sorts of things, that's the reason you see Fort Vancouver, which is a site you can still visit today. It's the reason you see it on the north bank of the Columbia and not maybe where Portland or the Willamette River comes in that area. Fort Vancouver. Again, it was the largest Hudson's Bay Company post in this administrative district that was called the Columbia Department, Columbia District. Fort Colville, which no longer exists. It's underneath the reservoir that was created over in eastern Washington now, the Roosevelt Reservoir. This is Fort Victoria. And if you know the city of Victoria, it's where it got its name, obviously. It started out as a Hudson's Bay Company fort. And if you've spent any time there and kind of remember just not too far from the Empress Hotel, there's an area called Bastion Square. I know it's sort of hard to see in this slide, but towards the very left-hand side, my pointer working here, right over there is a bastion, and that's right about where Bastion Square is in Victoria today. If you like to go antique shopping, and you know Fort Street, which is kind of one of those antique shopping streets that heads up towards Craigdarroch Castle, a big historic house you can go visit. It's named Fort Street because it kind of came into where the fort was. This is one of the earliest views we have of Fort Nisqually. It was a British artist, actually a British military agent that came through and drew that. The following year, a Canadian artist named Paul Kane was through here. And you'll notice on both of these views there's no palisade surrounding the fort like there is today. These views in the 1840s predate that. That went up in response to the Whitman Massacre in the late 1840s. It was a directive that came out to fortify these posts just in case there was going to be a lot of unrest in the area. So the Palisades here at Fort Nisqually only stood for about 10 years, from the late 1840s to the late 1850s. So that's why you see these two views without the palisade that we are so used to looking at here in Tacoma. Okay, a view of Fort Nisqually once that palisade was up. And again, I just threw this one in so you can try and get your mind out of this Point Defiance setting of Fort Nisqually. Way up here in the park, we're very heavily forested all around us. The original site, which is down by DuPont, a couple miles north of the Delta and the DuPont area, it was a much more wide open prairie and a much more logical place to build a fort. Remember, they were bringing all sorts of trade goods in here, sending lots of things out of here, tallow, hides, pelts, all sorts of things. And the last thing you wanted was a bluff like the one down here to the Narrows. There's no way your oxen were going to get up and down a bluff like that. So it was a much better location down there. You really kind of have to take your mind away from this fort, or this Point Defiance site here. This again is an artist rendering from the early 1980s about what the fort may have looked like in the 1850s when it was really going full tilt. There's some things we know differently now. Some archaeology has been done in the interim, and we know there was actually what was referred to as Nisqually Village, kind of here in the foreground where that cart is shown with some farming going on. The business of the Hudson's Bay Company was business. They weren't here to settle in the sense of the word that the Americans used it a little bit later on. They were here to make money through the fur trade. They got into all sorts of other little industries here and there as the years, the decades, even the centuries went on. But by and large, they were here to barter and to trade. And just a shot of what's behind the screen, since I'm blocking it there, the valuable trade goods that were coming in through here. And we know what we know about the Hudson's Bay Company and about, in some cases, about some of the wives and the women and families that were here from the remarkable records that the Hudson's Bay Company kept. Very, very detailed. Whether they survived or not at any given fort varies from post to post. In some places they didn't survive. The records at Fort Nisqually really survived very, very well. There's a group of about 2,000 different documents. The originals are all down in California at the Huntington Library. The closest we have access to them here in a complete form is in Olympia. They're on microfilm. We've done a lot of transcriptions over the years and various little pieces here and there. But the Hudson's Bay Company really was a remarkable operation in this regard. And there's, I mean, probably literally tons of information at various repositories in Canada and the northern United States. And this one, it's kind of hard to see. Maybe Mike could kind of just tilt that up. This is actually a journal. Maybe the other way, Mike, you can see the date. I believe it's December of 1854. This is a sheet of one of the journals that was kept at Fort Nisqually. And I just threw that in there so that you can see, and this is actually one of the much more easily read ones. A lot of them are microfilmed upside down or backwards, or there's stains across it, or there are a lot of problems trying to get in and looking at it. But at least it's there. At least we can spend time and really get into it and find out what they were saying. Hudson's Bay Company was a very socially stratified operation. This was not the American egalitarian ideal that everyone's going to come out and have equal opportunity and like some of the American pioneers were hoping for as they started to come out in ever-increasing numbers in the 1840s. If you like to think of it in that way, it's a little bit like a little bit of English society imported over here. Or if you enjoy watching some of the period dramas on Masterpiece Theater and can kind of put yourself in mind of those. You had a definite place. If you were educated, you had the ability to rise up through the ranks of the company. But if you were not educated or of the right sort of birth rank or origin, you were pretty much going to be spending your entire career in the company at one level. So, excuse me, I should have gone back and said, those were the gentlemen, obviously. They look pretty serious there. Some individuals in this room that might look a little familiar after this slide. These are the gentlemen, the officers, the commissioned members of the Hudson's Bay Company. This is just an example here at Fort Nisqually. Fort Nisqually obviously was one of the smaller, more junior forts. It was not as important in terms of overall strategy of the Columbia District as a place like Fort Vancouver, because that was the main depot. It's much larger. The bosses here at Fort Nisqually had to answer to the bosses at Vancouver, John McLaughlin. But you also had all sorts of other ranks here at Fort Nisqually. And this is an image actually at Fort Nisqually. The inscription there across the bottom is Half-Caste Indians Gambling. Again, this is a sketch done in the mid-1840s. And you can see the differences in clothing between these men and these men. And these are mixed blood men. So again, they might be a variety of ethnic backgrounds. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes here when we go into who was here. There were, of course, the Native Americans that were already here, that had been here for ages. There were French Canadians who, of course, had been in the Hudson's Bay Company employ and in the employ of the other rival companies before the Hudson's Bay Company was a monopoly. There were Scotsmen along with the French Canadians. There were English clerks, and that's who kept a lot of the records here, Scottish and English clerks, as well as at other forts. There were Hawaiians, or Kanakas as they're referred to in the records at Fort Nisqually and at other Hudson's Bay Company posts. The Hawaiian Islands, or the Sandwich Islands as they were known then, were on the worldwide trade routes of the Hudson's Bay Company and the other trade that was going on around the globe. And so it was quite common actually to find a number of Hawaiians at various Hudson's Bay Company posts, especially up in this area. And when you get into the servants' accounts sections of the records of Fort Nisqually, they're quite often listed by names. I don't know that much about Hawaiian phonetics, and so we just sort of guess at the pronunciation. But they show up regularly in the day-to-day journals, as well as in just tabulating what they were trading for in the shop. Americans were starting to come into this area in the 1840s and 1850s in particular, heading out across the trail and then heading north rather than south into the Willamette. Travel between all of these posts, and again, you kind of have to keep in mind that this is, most of the time you're picturing that it's men in these boats, but there are enough references and indications in someone's journal, the educated men's or the clerk's journals about, my wife accompanied me, our 3 children accompanied me. So even though a lot of this artwork that's been done in the 20th century doesn't picture it, this was one of the modes of transportation on the vast river systems of North America. I can't really think of one image, historic image, that really shows a lot of women and children in these boats, perhaps some of the ones of Francis Hopkins, but to my knowledge I'm not recalling any that really show the amount of women and children that were transported this way as well. The gentlemen, obviously, and the worker bees. Now there is a woman down to the lower left there with a child on her lap. And whether you were at the forts or out on brigade traveling between posts, the women were along. And again, sometimes or a lot of times it does not show up in the artwork, but they were there. Which is why I put this slide right after. And I don't know if it's obvious going through these slides, but we're about halfway through the slides I have to show, and this is really the first time a woman's shown up here. It is difficult to really get an idea of what life was like day to day for a lot of the women and families that were here. The things that we do know, we largely know about what you would consider probably the upper half of fur trade society. As I said, it was a very socially stratified organization, the Hudson's Bay Company, and that applied to the women as well as the men. You might have a couple of women from a local neighboring tribe that these men were marrying, and if one married the chief factor or the chief trader and the other one married the blacksmith, you'll probably be able to trace the woman who married a little bit higher in society and her sister. She may show up in a church record or something like that, or she may not. Sometimes the first instance that we have that some of the employees were even married is a reference to Mrs. So-and-so died today. And so that's it. They are very difficult to trace. But they were here. Families and children were here. I mean, the generations going on and on after of the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur traders. I mean, these people were not, as I was saying to someone earlier, were not spontaneously generating. I mean, it takes the other half of the equation to have the next generation come along. You just have to really search them out in the records. A little bit fort-based here now. This is one of our buildings here at Fort Nisqually. Again, just to point out, you have to look at these women depending on their rank in the company as to whether, or how prominently they're going to show up. This is much more of a laboring class dwelling. And just to make a point here, sometimes if you are a visitor to Fort Nisqually or any other Hudson's Bay Company post or historic sites in general, sometimes you wonder, well, gosh, I think the staff just maybe thought it would look neat over in that corner or whatever. If you're talking about some furnishings or were there curtains on the window, that sort of thing. We really try our best with the documentary evidence that we have to try and duplicate what was here. And I think you can see that just with the contrast of some of these slides here, that historic image and then this image from Fort Nisqually. So hopefully it isn't always our best guess. We hope to operate on the best information that we have. Again, this is a lower middle class example of a lower middle class dwelling. And these types of dwellings would have been lived in by women and children as well. If you were that sister that married into the upper ranks of the company, you were fortunate enough to have the material goods that brought you by virtue of your husband's rank, which quite often meant furnishings imported from England for your use, nice things for your table, probably being waited upon at your table, help around the house, that sort of thing. Now there are some images as the company and the fur trade companies spread across what is now Canada. When you say the word Canada, you have to be careful because if you say it in this period, you really are talking more about, you know, the Quebec area right around Montreal. Canada as a nation as we know it, and we have some very welcome Canadians with us in the group today, did not exist as a nation as we know it until 1867. So when I'm saying Canada, if I sort of catch myself and say that, I'm referring to really the Montreal area, not to Manitoba or not to British Columbia. It did not exist yet at the time we're talking about. This is a view from back in eastern Canada, what's now Eastern Canada, and you can see the women in this view. The first indication that there's some affiliation with the Hudson's Bay Company is just in the presence of all the cloth that they're wearing. And in attempting to copy the European mode of dress. If you look at those two women on the left, this is what we refer to as the Canada dress. It wasn't a term we invented. It shows up in a lot of the historical documents as well, by some of the Americans even, referring to this particular style. There's a reference to it down at Fort Vancouver as well. And if you are interested in the history of fashion, and it's kind of hard to tell because they're sitting down, but this is very typical of, say, the Dolly Madison period, the early federal period in the United States history, or Jane Austen, if you like Jane Austen novels. That very high empire waist with the low neck on it was adopted by the Native American and mixed blood women simply because it facilitated the nursing of children. And it shows up in a number of various views. And here it is in some of the reenactors who have come and participated in some of our events. The women at Hudson's Bay Company forts, around Hudson's Bay Company forts, when the Hudson's Bay Company was first here, as well as the Northwest Company, some of those other rivals that they had in the earlier days, they were marrying into the local Indian tribes. And that had advantages for both, as you might imagine. There were a lot of skills, knowledge of the country that the native women could bring to the Hudson's Bay Company. After all, they were relatively small enclaves of European men who needed help with the business that they were about. And marrying into the local tribes gained them lots of advantages, political advantages and alliances, help between all these various brigade routes, and there were material advantages for the women as well. After decades of this, then of course you have generations of young mixed blood women growing up with Native American, and by that I mean Canadian as well, Native North American, women or heritage on their mother's side, and European, whether it's Dutch, whether it's Swiss, Scots, whatever it may be on their father's side. And these women became very desirable as fur trade wives as well, again because they could sort of straddle the two worlds. They did tend to be more fort-based rather than, say, if something happened to their husband or if he left them. It was more difficult for that second and third generation of women to try and go back to tribal life than it had been, say, for their mothers who were full-blood and could still remember their customs and traditions and had relations in the tribe to go back to. The Hudson's Bay Company tried to discourage this at first because, again, the profit motive. They didn't want to be supporting a lot of women and children. And not all of the men, but this form of marriage without benefit of clear records, when you're looking really at the social history, other men did something that came to be known as turning off. If you were being moved from one post to another, which happened frequently, the Hudson's Bay Company was almost like a military operation in that regard. You'd be moved from post to post, assignment to assignment. Perhaps he just wasn't that fond of her. Perhaps she was just more of an encumbrance. The children maybe as well. And the custom arose called being turned off. You would turn off your country wife, which is what they were referred to as, and find some other man who was still at that post to support her. So you read sometimes of some of these men finding someone else to turn off Nancy or Betsy or whatever sort of anglicized name they've given her. So both things happened, and that's some of the difficulty in tracing some of these women, say from the middle or lower ranks, is because once they were turned off by perhaps more of a prominent man, because he was being moved to another assignment, sometimes they just fall away from the record. So you might be able to follow someone for a while, and then you just don't hear any more about her. But again, I put this one in so that you could contrast, again, the clothing styles that you see people wearing around at reenactments or Living History Days, is because we are attempting to work, again, with the documents to accurately reflect what was there. And I was going to go back and forth between this one and this one, because, again, it illustrates the access to material finery that you would have depending on your husband's rank. Here are mixed-blood women. It's probably the middle to lower class of the Hudson's Bay Company men. Whoops, I went back too far. And here's the wife of a chief trader, chief factor. You can see she's adopted the European hair fashions, probably at the encouragement of her husband. She still is wearing some trade beads there, though, as well. This one happens to be standing by an officer of Russian America. Again, the women and men, your rank depending on your husband's rank. This one, Mike, can you tilt that so there's a great quote at the bottom here. You might have to focus that just a little bit. It says, Killacoda, Chinook wife of James McMillan, who abandoned her to search for a lady of, quote, genteel accomplishment and dutiful obedience. Those wonderful characteristics. And as I said, this woman was from the Chinook tribe originally, and lived with James McMillan. And eventually, as the decades went on, you get closer up to the time that we're talking about with Fort Nisqually. This did happen to some women. These men would not just sort of abandon her and go on to assignment at their next post. With the Hudson's Bay Company, once you were a certain rank, you had the privilege of going back to England, back to civilization, as it were, for maybe a year or two. And a number of higher-ranking Hudson's Bay Company men in North America did come back with European wives, which really sort of set the whole, what we refer to as fur trade society, on its ear, because then you really do sense in some of the documents and some of the things that show up that there was a lot of prejudice starting towards even this mixed blood level of fur trade society woman, if you like. Even to the point where perhaps you'll have a woman whose mother is half Native and her father's Irish, so that really only makes her a quarter Native American, but there's this prejudice against her because she's tainted with this Native American stigma. I mean, it's difficult to judge them. They were operating in a totally different century than we are, but it is there and you have to be aware of it. And I'm going to point out, and if you're interested in this whole very transitional period, once these European women started arriving, and they were educated women, they were writing down comments and diaries and that sort of thing, you really can get an interesting feel for what life was like for some of these women. But again, you can see that obvious Native American influence. And I put this one in as well as the next one, and I'm going to go back and forth between these two here, because they were both done just about a year apart from each other. The first one is a sketch by Paul Kane, and it's a woman who lived across the inlet from Fort Victoria up on Vancouver Island. It was done in 1847. This one, the other one, was done just a couple of years before, and the inscription at the bottom says, "My partner at a grand ball given at Fort Victoria, October 1845." So again, you can see the difference between a woman who is still living pretty much within the culture in which she'd grown up. She was drawn in the village in which she was living at the time, as opposed to that woman who was living, obviously a woman based at the fort, probably a mixed-blood woman, and again with the European dress. She still is wearing her trade beads, but she's wearing an apron, very Europeanized there. The European style of dress, but she still has leggings on and probably moccasins. It's hard to tell without the detail there. But again, he's gone to the trouble of showing her in profile there to show you that her head has been flattened, which was the custom of so many of the various groups on this side of the mountains. And again, you can see this woman in profile, same thing. And just for fun, I threw in a picture of the rest of that ball. He drew his partner close up, and then there's very roughly sketched the ball at Fort Victoria. So it was not all hard work here. They did have occasions for fun, and there's some marvelous references about some of the social occasions where they talk about the men not being able to keep up, and how the Native American and even the mixed blood women danced, and they just tire the men out. So marvelous period descriptions of that. Again, a woman from Dog River, which is actually up in the closer back in the Ontario area. But again, the European hat and whatever sort of shirt or jacket she's wearing with the obvious European lapels on it. And okay, we're finally getting to some of the actual photographs that we have, and these are some of the women I'll talk about in just a little bit more detail. This is Marguerite McLaughlin. She was essentially the first lady of the Columbia Department. She was the wife of John McLaughlin, who was in charge of Fort Vancouver. And out of Fort Vancouver, he was essentially affecting and directing everything that was going on between Yerba Buena, which is San Francisco, on up to Russian Alaska and over to the Rocky Mountains. So essentially modern-day Northern California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and over to the Rockies. So it was a vast administrative area that he had. We know a fair amount about Marguerite McLaughlin, again, because she was married to a prominent man. He was her second husband. She had already had a fur trade marriage to a man named McKay, had 4 children with him, and he was one of the historians who perished around 1810, 1811. She subsequently wed McLaughlin back in, I believe it was at Fort William, and then came west with him. When he was given the assignment in the 1820s to establish and get Fort Vancouver up and operating, she came west with him. And again, had 4 children with him. And this was taken, this picture is, a lot of the times the school children will wonder, you know, what's wrong with her? Her hands appear to be so swollen. This is probably towards the end of her life. She died in the 1850s. So she's a much older woman. And we don't really know the cause of death, but we just explained to the kids that it's probably some sort of swelling that she's had in her hands. It could have been diabetes, could have been kidney problems, any number of things. This is John McLaughlin, her husband. He's referred to as the white-headed eagle, the father of Oregon as well. This is Amelia Douglas, and I neglected to say that Marguerite was was half Cree and half. We believe most of the records say Swiss, so they could, by Swiss they could mean the French type of Swiss. Her maiden name was Wadden, or Wadin. This is Amelia Douglas, Amelia Connolly Douglas. Her mother was Cree and her father was William Connolly, a Scotsman. And she was spent her early years at Fort St. James, up on the edge of Stewart Lake, halfway up BC. If anybody's been there, I was there a couple of summers ago and took long enough to get there using the highway. So I can't imagine being up there. That fort was established around 1805, 1806. I cannot imagine spending a winter on the edge of Stewart Lake that long ago, but that's where she was from. I believe she was born at Norway House, if I'm not mistaken, which is back over in Manitoba. I saw someone walk in with a Winnipeg jacket, so if I'm wrong, please excuse me. This is her husband, James Douglas, who was sort of in charge, the second in command, down at Fort Vancouver with McLaughlin. So Amelia, his wife, and Marguerite McLaughlin were essentially like First Lady and Tipper Gore, I guess, at Fort Vancouver. They were for the creme de la creme, but they were both, by all accounts, pretty retiring women. They were more comfortable speaking Cree or French than they were English. So you can imagine when people like Narcissa Whitman and some of the other early Americans were coming out, they really were quite exotic for someone coming from the Boston area or New England. And there's in the most recent issue of Columbia Magazine, there's an article on side saddles and riding side saddle and what that was like to come out here. And she makes a very interesting point of Narcissa Whitman and these other very genteel, proper American missionaries coming out riding side saddle, if you can imagine. And going out riding with Mrs. McLaughlin, who still preferred the Native American or Indian fashion, as she calls it, which was straddling the horse. And this was a real eye-opener for an American woman coming out and seeing how these women of mixed descent did it. This is Josette Work, Josette Lagacé Work. You can hear the French-Canadian influence in her background. She was the mother of a couple of the women that were living here at Fort Nisqually for a number of years. And again, the pictures of these women, a lot of them are later in their lives. They look like proper Victorian matrons, which is what they were at the time that these pictures were taken. If you've been down to the original, or the Big History Museum downtown in Tacoma, and you start out with the Lewis and Clark diorama, you go around the corner there. The second one in is sort of a trading scene at a Hudson's Bay Company post, and it is Josette Work, pictured at a younger age. This is what she looked like later in life.
And John,
Yes, and John. Can't forget John. This was her husband, John Work. He was an Irishman. And they had a family of mostly daughters. Again, a lot of these families, as a lot of 19th century families did, were very large. Some of these men were probably into their 30s, some of them into their late 30s. And I know that Amelia Douglas was relatively young, 16, 17 when she married, so there was certainly time there to have large families. And his daughters, he had more daughters than sons, and they were considered top catches for the up-and-coming clerks of the Hudson's Bay Company. Again, he was a chief factor, so it was a good thing to get hooked up with the boss's daughter. I mean, if you were going to look at it that way, it was a good person to marry. This is a woman named Jane Klein MacDonald. Again, her mother was Cree, and her father was actually Dutch. Middle name, or her maiden name, Klein, K-L-Y-N-E, as it's usually spelled. And she didn't really spend any time here at Fort Nisqually, but her husband did. He was the one that was responsible for establishing the location of Fort Nisqually in 1833. He spent most of his career at Langley and at Colville, but he was through here in the spring of 1833. And it's hard to tell sometimes if, when she was with him. Sometimes these women are referred to in the Hudson's Bay Company journals as being present with their husband, but most often not. For instance, when Dr. Tolmie, who was the man in charge here, got married, there's no reference to his being, well, there's a reference to his being gone for about a month, but it doesn't say why. He was up at Fort Victoria getting married, which you'd think would be, something to comment upon, but no. You have to go to the church records up in Victoria to find it. This is her husband, Archibald MacDonald. Now this is one, and it's kind of hard to see. Mike, you might have to tilt it for me. One of the women that I think is really interesting and remarkable here at Fort Nisqually is a woman named Helene MacDonald Kitson. She was here in the 1830s. We don't have any photograph of her. She lived into the 1860s, so it's a possibility that one might exist, but I've never seen one. Go back to that record.
Oh, sorry.
And so what I put up here was an example of some of these other places where we can get this information, since they don't show up in the records that often, the official Hudson's Bay Company records. These are the Catholic Church records from this area, and obviously it's a transcription. These were itinerant Jesuits that were coming through. This happens to be in the 1830s. And Mike, can you focus that anymore?
Well, yeah, that's what I did before.
What I'm looking at is this reference up here, and what it is the marriage record. I'm going to try and read it out loud.
Good there, that's good.
It just talks about, okay, the 29th of April, 1839, and it's a marriage between William Kitson and Helene MacDonald. Comments on him being a member of the Protestant religion on the one part, and Demoiselle Helene MacDonald, member of the Catholic religion, daughter of Finan MacDonald and of Charlotte Ponderay. When you see the women, the mixed blood women, or even the full blood women showing up in the records, usually they'll give them an anglicized first name like Charlotte or Betsy or Nancy, like I was saying. And then as a surname, they'll use whatever their tribal origin is. So in this case, Ponderay. You'll see Betsy Nisqually or someone else, Chinook, Marguerite Chinook. So again, that's a clue as to what their ethnic background is. You can get other clues in here. Obviously, there's one down here at the bottom. The bride having declared not knowing how to sign. So again, you can get an indication if she was educated or not. I have seen a reference that she was sent back to a convent in Ontario for a while, so you would have assumed she would have picked up some information there. Maybe that reference is not correct. There's a collection of manuscripts down at the Oregon Historical Society Library that I haven't looked at yet that's supposed to have more information on her. But again, this is a page out of the records. And a few days later, okay, here's their marriage. And a few days earlier, actually, I'm kind of doing these backwards. There's a reference up at the top. What you're looking at. Okay. We, priest undersigned, have baptized Pierre Charles, aged 6 years, natural child of William Kitson, clerk in charge of the service of the Honorable Company at Hudson's Bay, and of Helene MacDonald. And then it mentions who the godparents are. So again, the missionaries would come through and leave us these valuable records because we can get the baptismal dates. They'll comment on the age of the child, so you can do the math and try and figure out, who belongs to whom. At the bottom down there's another intriguing reference because they talk about baptizing another one of William Kitson's sons named Jules, but he is the son of I can't remember exactly how it says it. Son of William Kitson and an Indian woman. So again, this is the first indication that you have that Kitson probably had another country marriage before Helene. with a Kootenai woman, as far as we can tell. And I put this in, this is Amelia Douglas again, and Josette Lagacé, because they were both born about the same year that Helene MacDonald Kitson was. So in the absence of any picture of Helene, I think sometimes it's kind of helpful to just sort of look at some of who her contemporaries would have been. She, after Kitson died at Fort Vancouver around 1841, she married again within the Hudson's Bay Company. This was very, very common. There's a journal at Fort Vancouver that comments on her getting married in the mess hall down at Fort Vancouver. And she then went on to Fort Hall and died in the 1860s. This is Jane Tolmie. She was essentially, if you want to use the First Lady reference again, she was essentially the First Lady at Fort Nisqually. She was the daughter of one of those very marriageable daughters of John Work and his wife. And she was here at Fort Nisqually from about 1850 to 1859. She very rarely shows up in the records. She was an educated woman for the day. She knew how to read and write. She was very good friends with some of the Douglas daughters. There's one surviving letter that we know of that's in the archives up in Victoria, coming back here to Jane, that's very gossipy, wonderful letter, because it just has all sorts of references to people they knew in common, who was pregnant, what was going on in Victoria, all this very interesting stuff, but there's no response. And we've checked the archives in Victoria, and there's just no record of any of her correspondence. Perhaps it was lost, perhaps it was intentionally destroyed, which was something that was fairly frequently done in Victorian days. So she's very intriguing. She had, if you read the newspaper article, she had a number of children, if you can imagine living in that White House over there, which is not all that big. And by the time of 1859, she had 6 children, as far as we can tell, mostly boys. By the 1855, which is the year that we portrayed our candlelight tour here, she had 4 boys under the age of 5, which I have 2, and I cannot imagine. What must have been I just really can't.
Amelia Douglas had 13.
Yes, yeah, but I don't think all of them survived to adulthood. So, this is William Tolmie, her husband, who was born in Scotland in Inverness. He was educated as a physician, and that was actually his first assignment with the company. And then he just sort of started taking on more and more administrative work for the company as well, although he was kind of frequently, over the years, called on to do medical things as well. And this is Jane Tolmie, and Dr. Tolmie later in life, again, when they're prominent citizens in Victoria.
Go back to Jane. We've never seen that picture before.
This one?
Yes. Where'd you find it?
I think I'd have to look, but I think it's Provincial Archives of British Columbia.
One of their sons went on to become the Premier of British Columbia.
Yes.
Later.
Their youngest son, Simon Fraser Tolmie, and he just died in 1837. So there's.
Can you imagine going to work for a company and having them shoot you way out here?
No, and it's amazing reading his journal. He was a young man of 21. I think he even turns 21 on the voyage. So he's leaving home and family at the age of 20. He's got this months-long journey, and he's reading, I mean, it makes you feel like, oh, I don't do enough. He's reading Latin, he's doing this, he's cutting up specimens that he's collecting, you know, a bird or fish, because he was very interested in botany and science, and he's some Rosses there. Very interesting place to go look around. Oh, excuse me, went on here to... This is another page from the journal that I just threw in there because I thought it was interesting. Our photographer just happened to choose this page to photograph because he thought it would photograph well, and I know it's difficult to read. But down here at the bottom, this is an entry from, I believe, the mid-1850s anyway. And there's a line here that illustrates what I'm talking about. You'll have a couple of names of the men, the laborers that were working and supervising some of the work that was going on. I think it's Ross and it's Charles Lagacé with gang of Indian women shearing sheep. Okay, so they're Indian women and there's more than one of them, but you just don't get a whole lot of detail. And they go on to talk about they finished shearing 2 bands, upwards of 1,000 sheep, so a lot of hard work. And then they talk about a canoe arrived from Victoria this day with letters. Dr. and Mrs. Helmkin, he was a son-in-law of Douglas and his daughter. And then Mrs. Douglas and 3 children were arriving and planning to spend the time here at Fort Nisqually for a while because of their health, or for reasons of health, it says. And then mentions those 3 children in that reference, and then the next shot is 3 of those children. Now again, you can sort of tell that these are young women who have access to finer things. This probably shows these women, judging by the clothing, sometime in probably the late 50s, even the early 60s. Clothing sort of gives that away, and that reference was probably 10 years earlier. But there was a lot of back and forth. A lot of these people knew each other. It was a very, relatively small community of people. And I just threw that in again to contrast the mixed blood women that were probably more at a middle to lower rank and those Douglas daughters, because of their father's rank, the access to things that they had. This is the Ptolemy family later on in Victoria, probably into, well, it says 1877 there. Quite a large family, and his home stood in Victoria till about 1863, and then it was pulled down. Excuse me, 1963. And then just to indicate or underline the continuity again, here's a picture of the house across the way here, where our museum is now. It was the Factor's house, the large house at Fort Nisqually. This is down on the original site before it was moved up here into Point Defiance. And these are sons of Huggins, who was one of the clerks here at Fort Nisqually. And in the next scene, you can see it's the same day, same occasion, same group of people. There's John Ptolemy, who is a son of Dr. Ptolemy, another one of that large family. And Huggins, Thomas Huggins, is the gentleman up on the porch. So these cousins were growing up together, doing a lot back and forth. This is actually after the turn of the century. They were here on a picnic day down at the original site, probably around 1906. So you can watch these families, move from the emigration from Scotland, the marriage into sometimes existing communities already here if they married into the local tribes, and then on into the present century. And I sort of like to end with that sort of Brigadooni slide again, just to bring it back to the present. And I was going to talk, just sort of refer you to some of the books here that we know, that we use quite frequently, and then I'll just open it up to questions. The Journal of Occurrences, which is the record of day-to-day action here at Fort Nisqually from about 1833 up through the 1850s and into the 60s, has been transcribed. It's not something that's a published type of book. We reprint it here, and you can use it here. We do have copies for sale here. So you don't have to go in and really use those old records. If you want to look at ship's manifests or invoices or servants' accounts, letter books, that sort of thing, the copy books, because obviously they didn't have photocopy machines. There was a clerk that copied every letter verbatim that went out. The letter was sent out, but someone had to copy that letter down so you had that record of correspondence. So all of those things survive. A lot of those things you'd have to go back into the original records or microfilm, but the day-to-day journals we have a transcription of here. There are a couple of historians that are still working, in the middle of their careers, mainly at Canadian universities, because this is much more of a focus of study in Canada than it is in the United States. A woman named Sylvia Van Kirk and another woman named Jennifer Brown, who've written the two books that are really kind of considered the main groundbreaking work in women's history of the fur trade. This is called Many Tender Ties. It's excellent. They're both excellent, just in different ways. This is much more narrative, unfolds more like a story. This one takes a little bit more work to get through, not because it isn't fascinating, but it's a lot more statistical analysis of taking journals and lists of company employees and their references to their wives and families, and really tabulating it and putting it into some modern statistical format, and seeing what happens when you make charts and pie graphs and that sort of thing. You really can get an idea of some of the points she's trying to make. There are some of the other original records we refer to, like the Catholic Church records. Those have been transcribed. You don't have to go through the originals. Wonderful new book that just came out about Fort Langley that analyzes some of the journals kept at Fort Langley. We have Dr. Ptolemy's diary from about an 11-year period when he was a young man just coming over here. That's when he was referring to not working hard enough. He's spending all those days on board ship and studying a lot more than I did. There are other biographies out here on James Douglas, on Archibald MacDonald, but again, notice that I'm saying on those men. There aren't really any biographies in book form that have come out recently on their wives. We've always felt, and will continue to feel, that in the Nisqually papers there's probably 50 to 100 dissertations just waiting on, whether it's on people or anything you want to study. It's just a vast, untapped amount of material. That's something that we'd like to sit and do nothing but that, but we also do all the other things at Fort Nisqually as well. There's other references to a lot of these people. When you start reading about the Americans that were arriving in this area in the 1850s, they'll refer back to the people that were already here, both the Native Americans as well as the Hudson's Bay Company. We have other things. Cecilia Carpenter's book is a wonderful book just on Fort Nisqually, just to give you a good introduction to what was going on here. There's some other unpublished monographs out of Fort Vancouver, just on women of Fort Vancouver, or the social history of Fort Vancouver. looking at this type of history has really only been going on in a formal sense in the professional historical world in about the last maybe 25 to 30 years. Up until that time, there really wasn't much of a focus on what's now known as women's studies or gender studies, but it is something, obviously, since these two main books in the field have come out, that's really come into its own. And there's a lot of wonderful new information. We just got a book here in the office just last week. I haven't even had a chance to really look at it. And it's all about the revision of a traditional focus on the fur trade, looking at all of these other aspects, the family life, the social life, how maybe what sites, like Fort Nisqually are doing right to really reflect that, have what we're doing that's not good enough yet to really try and give visitors an accurate reflection of what life may have been like. So you're more than welcome to come up here and take some references down or citations down if you'd like to do any further reading. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer. Yes.
When did they bring this replica fort up here?
When did they bring Fort Nisqually up here? The fort was moved. Two of the buildings were moved in the 1930s. The fort stood on its original site, first part of the original site, from about 1833 to 1843. It was moved a little bit further for a better location, and it stood in that location while the Hudson's Bay Company had it. Hudson's Bay Company formally left in about 1869. And then the last man who'd been the last clerk here stayed on, farmed it for about 30 years, and he sold to DuPont, the DuPont Company, in 1906. So really the original site property has really only been in a few hands since the Hudson's Bay Company had it. The Weyerhaeuser Company bought it from the DuPont Company in the 70s and have been working, obviously, the last 10 or so years very actively in developing it into Northwest Landing, which is the planned community that you see going up down there by the new State Farm building.
Was it Huggins that sold to DuPont?
Yes, yeah. And there's a couple people I see in the room here. I was going to point this out. Again, the whole point of continuity of these families, and they're not just historical people to study, that their presence in one form or another is still with us through some of these great documents that you can look at or other references you can read. And Judy Bridges is here. She's one of our volunteers. And I'm sorry, sir, I've forgotten your name, but I know you're with the descendants of Fort Nisqually.
John Milner.
John Milner is here. And both of these people are descended from employees that worked at Fort Nisqually in the 1840s and 50s. So there is a group of Fort Nisqually descendants that have banded together and shared information. And Kitson, there's a large branch of the Kitson family that now lives over in the Tri-Cities area, and we see them come through every now and then. So sometimes they have, that one family person that tends to be the family genealogist will share information with us, and we can file it away. And yes?
I'd like to correct that. It's my wife who is descended.
I'm sorry.
And I'm the genealogist of the family, so.
I'm glad to hear that, because a lot of times it's reversed, it's the woman who has to do everything.
And you're a Fort Nisqually in-law.
Well, if there's no other questions, you're probably wanting to... Before we break up, I have an announcement for the